the mid-80s, my mom was a cleaner in Australia. She would clean houses in suburban areas and would sometimes have clients in rural wine regions. She would leave business cards at the local shops and got most of her business that way, finding the rest of her clients through word of mouth. One day she got a call from a lady who sounded like she was around 60, asking my mom to clean her old farmhouse and making a lot of odd demands. Mom would usually meet with clients before taking on new business, but in this case, the lady didn't want to meet her and said she would just leave the keys under the front doormat. Mom agreed, mainly because the lady was quite obviously wealthy and was offering to pay her substantially more than she would reasonably expect. Mom went to the house on a Monday morning and said she already felt unnerved by the long driveway. The house was in the middle of a very large and very empty property. She found the keys and started cleaning. About an hour into the clean, she hears the back door shut. She was told no one would be at the house, so she immediately felt unsafe. She stood frozen in the kitchen for what she said felt like 5 full minutes. There was no other car on the property. She wanted to leave immediately, but still had 2 bedrooms to clean. She said as time passed and she heard nothing else, she decided that perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps something had fallen and it wasn't the door after all. She walked up the hallway and stepped into the first bedroom. All over the bed were black and white photos. As my mom got closer, she realized the photos were all of her. Some were taken at our family home, and many others were taken at houses my mom had cleaned, through their windows or over their fences. She used the house phone to call the police and immediately drove to the end of the driveway. The lady ended up being investigated, but continued to claim that it was a break-in. After some time, the police stopped with their searching, and we just ended up moving to a new town 4 months later. Every time Mom talks about this experience, I get serious chills. To this day, she thinks the lady had something to do with those mysterious pictures. But why? And for what purpose? A few years ago, I happened to have some business in Chicago that related to some legal issues I had when I was younger and stupid. As a teenage rebel, I had associated with a group of sketchy drug users. They ended up getting me arrested over something I was completely innocent of, and while trying to apply for my citizenship, the incident was brought up. Thus, I had to return to my home state of Illinois to find evidence that my arrest as a minor was expunged for the right reasons. Anyway, in light of wanting to turn a stress-inducing trip into something more positive, I decided to reconnect with an old high school friend who happened to live a few hours away from where I was staying. His name was Mark. Mark and I shared many a good memory. It might even be fair to call him my first real friend. I was friends with him on Facebook and we occasionally spoke, but I honestly didn't know much about his current life, as our conversations were often about stuff like music. I asked him to meet me at a local bar, and off I went, excited to see my friend of long ago. When I got there, the first thing that struck me as, well, rather odd, was the fact that he had gained a lot of weight. His Facebook didn't have any recent pictures, so this took me by surprise. Mark was a skinny person when I last saw him, partially due to his addiction to amphetamines, which rubbed off on me a bit, but I've been 4 years clean thanks to NA. And his hair, well, it just wasn't the same. You're probably thinking, what do I mean by that? It wasn't the haircut, as I expected that to be different. It wasn't even his hair color. It was the fact that it wasn't curly anymore. I attributed this to a variety of potential reasons, and I felt like asking would sound silly, or maybe I just felt uneasy at that point, but either way, I chose to disregard this discrepancy. The night went on, and our conversations revolved around old memories, and slowly the uneasiness turned into happiness of meeting with an old friend. We got pretty drunk and decided to take a taxi back to his place, where he promised he had a surprise for me. I told him I didn't do drugs anymore, as this would usually constitute a surprise when we were younger, but he promised that wasn't it. When we got there, I realized Mark was living on the bad side of town. It was shady, but I felt safely intoxicated and didn't fear the vagrants outside. Besides, I'd soon be in his house. Mark kept talking about the surprise, emphasizing that I'll love it. The way he kept repeating this, despite my efforts to move the conversation into something else, seemed a bit weird, but I figured he was just excited to give me whatever it was he wanted to share. When I got into his apartment, I sat down. He asked if I wanted some water, which I accepted. After saying once more how much I'll love his surprise, he walked into his room and brought out something wrapped in blankets. Inside was an aged bottle of whiskey, my favorite brand, and I was touched by Mark's memory of what I liked. The night went on and we broke into it, getting drunker and drunker. Eventually I passed out, and when morning came, I took a taxi back to my motel, happy with how the whole night had turned out. It wasn't until years later that I found out Mark had died from a drug overdose a year after I graduated high school and moved to New Jersey. The news came up when I told another friend of my encounter, which was followed by weird looks that seemed like concern. I insisted that I had seen Mark that night, several years after he had apparently passed away, but of course, nobody believed me. Instead, they offered the explanation that my encounter was the result of grief. But I was ignorant of his death until that moment. Or maybe they suggested all those years of hard drug abuse caught up with me and it was time to see a doctor. His Facebook got taken down a few months after our encounter and I didn't think much of it, just assumed he got sick of the social media thing or something, so I have no proof of what I claim except the memory of the last time I saw my best friend. About 10 years ago, I got into bird watching. I was only 12, so it really wasn't official by any means. I was just some kid that liked to sneak up on birds, take pictures of them, and look them up in books. I decided to start this hobby by making a list of native birds in my region. Every weekend, I'd wander around the neighborhood, which was suburbs smashed haltingly against large plots of land covered in brush, in search of new birds. With a few ponds and a large creek in the area, I found quite a few within my first few weeks. However, there was one bird that I had set as my sort of white whale, due to its rarity in the area: the black vulture. We have tons of turkey vultures in my area. They're the most common, but we have much fewer black vultures. It's a bit hard to tell the difference if they're flying too high. It was best to determine which vulture you were looking at by seeing how much gray or white was on their wings. If they got closer, you can eventually even make out the red head of the turkey vulture, as I often did, disappointingly. Unfortunately, I can't remember the exact date of this event, or what month it was, but I believe it was sometime in the fall. One weekend, I decided to spend 2 days searching high and low for the black vulture. I climbed over the small wire fencing around a nearby brushy area, as per usual, keep out signs be damned, and searched. Usually you had the best luck finding scavenger birds on roadkill, beside the road. There just so happened to be a small 2-lane winder that mirrored the creek nearby, just through the foliage. So I cut across the sort of mini forest headed in that direction. As much as it made me sad to see a dead deer or possum, it was a pretty common sight on this road. Both sides are open, with trees and undergrowth almost choking it. There are some parts of the road that almost become sort of a tunnel due to the leaves intertwining above. It was incredibly easy for a deer or some other animal to jump out in front of a car in the dark, with neither party realizing until it was too late. Unfortunately, I didn't have much luck. There were a few crows on the smear of a squirrel, and I saw a few ducks swimming in the creek beside me, but nothing big. It started to get late, but the sun was still up, and despite the dangers of walking down a forest road in the dark, I was determined to stay out as long as possible. I decided I'd wait until I reached a small park area at the end of the road, and then I'd finally make my way back. I went under a small tunnel of leaves and came out the other side, and was delighted to see the familiar shape of a large bird in the sky, circling. It was just the right shape and size to be a vulture, but I had no hope of checking for the grayness of its feathers, as the sunlight was limited. Instead, I was stuck following it as it slowly began to sink lower. After about 10 minutes or so, it landed, and I carefully snuck forward, cautiously avoiding anything that could alert the bird to my presence. I sunk low to the ground, realizing that the bird had landed in a small clearing at the far end of the park. It was just a small, open field, slightly tilted down a hill, with the parking lot on top. I had been there before. It was a fun spot for kids to roll down the hill because of how steep it was. I approached it from the bottom, excitement brimming when I heard several squawks and shrieks of other birds. Black vultures are more aggressive than turkeys, and I was hoping to catch a spat. I got to the edge of the clearing and pulled out my binoculars. Two things kind of hit me at once here. One, I found it odd that they were in the middle of the park rather than closer to the road, where you'd assume they'd find good roadkill. Though I reasoned things could die anywhere, even in the middle of the park. However, the second thing I noticed was the smell. Awful. The scent was rather light, but I've been known to have a really sensitive nose, and this sharp, coppery scent, like when you pull rotten meat out of a bag. I had smelled roadkill before in the heat of the afternoon, and it smelled bad, but nothing like this. When I put my binoculars to my eyes, I expected to see a deer corpse and birds biting. I never, in a million years, thought that I would see a corpse of a completely different kind. I remember the faint pang of excitement I still had, recognizing the proud head of a black vulture, before the image of it sitting on the chest of a naked woman sucked the life out of me. I was frozen, and I couldn't look away. My throat tightened with vomit, and I still could not look away. The birds had done surprisingly little to her body. She had what I think were cuts, but most of her was still intact. What wasn't intact, the birds were picking at. Her eyes, lips, and genitals were red and shredded. If there was a big defining wound, I missed it between the gathering of birds and the fading light. But what I did see, I can never forget. I haven't forgotten. I can pull up the image so clearly now, even after all this time. She was pale, almost blue in places, with blonde, crinkled hair. I sat there stupidly for who knows how long, as the sun sunk beneath the trees. This was a time before cell phones were common, and I had quite the hike back home. I realized now that I was in shock. I could only move when the sudden fear that whoever did this could be nearby hit me. I forced myself to slowly waddle backwards to the trees, not ever taking my eyes off the body. I didn't want to turn around for some reason. I was so scared that someone would be behind me. I thought if I just backed up forever, maybe nothing would happen. It was dusk, and suddenly there was light. High beams from the top of the hill, a single pair. I heard the screech of tires as the car wheeled out, and listened to it veer off to the left and away down the road, opposite in the direction I was headed. That was the last straw. I was too scared. I ran the entire way back the second I could no longer hear the car. I crashed through at least a mile of brush, and while I was smart enough to have boots and thick jeans on, My arms were bare and bleeding by the time I stopped. I paused midway through the brush by my house, realizing that, embarrassingly enough, I had pissed myself in fear before nearly crawling my way through people's yards to get home, avoiding all passing cars. The horror didn't completely end there. I was home alone until past midnight as my mom worked late at a diner nearby. It's stupid, and I regret it to this day, but no, I did not call the police instantly. I didn't even contact my mom. I was stupidly afraid that if I did, my mom would get mad at me and I would never be allowed to go outside again. Or worse, that they wouldn't believe me for some reason. I went around the house locking all the doors, and then went around again to double check. I took a shower and locked myself in my room. I had fallen asleep somehow by the time my mom came home. I finally spoke to her about it in the morning, but by that time when we made the call together, the body had already been found. They took my statement, and we never got any calls back. I stopped bird watching that day.